repurposing. I guess ultimately it's kind of a fancy name for recycling. And it is amazing if you look at some of the nations across the world, some of the nations that have a high rate of poverty. It's remarkable what's recycled, reused. Just about everything that they have, they make or use into something else. So this creative repurposing is something that we see a lot of, not just in this country, but all across the world. And it's good that we do that, because we do need to be responsible for our environment. We are stewards of this world and the environment that we have. And it's important that we take care of those things. And that creative repurposing takes something that is ultimately going to be thrown out and turns it into something that has a purpose and a use. And that's important. But when we really stop to think about this creative repurposing and this recycling and going green, bottom line is, when you stop to think about it, God has been in that business for centuries, hasn't he? And that's what God has been doing for centuries. Creatively repurposing people's lives. That's the business of God. And that needs to be the business of the church. I mean, you look at Paul. For example, you look at Paul, I also want to throw in a little bit of Galatians chapter 2 and use it with this Philippians chapter 3, but it's interesting. Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, he's talking about what's going on in his life. And in his letter, he says that we ourselves are Jews by birth. He's talking about the people of God when he was, a Pharisee. He said, people have been working for generations to be made right with God, and they were being made right with God by trying to do the works of the law. In other words, Paul grew up believing that in order to be justified, in order to be made right with God, it was by doing all the correct things according to the laws of the Bible. God gave us these laws. You follow these laws, you're going to be made right with God. And so, all of a sudden, Paul comes along here in Philippians, and Paul's bragging about it. He's saying, you think you've got it made in this righteousness thing with God. I've got your hands down. I'm way ahead of you. I mean, look what he says here about this. He's confident about this. He says, I was circumcised. I'm a Jew. In fact, he goes beyond that, and I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm purebred. I'm a purebred Jew. And when it comes to the law, I'm a Pharisee. When it comes to my zeal, I persecuted the church. When it comes to righteousness under the law, I was blameless. How many of us can claim that title and say we're blameless? Paul says, I'm blameless according to the law. I've done it all. Yes, he was blameless when it came to being right with God through the law. Paul was batting 1,000. And yet look what he says later on in Philippians, verses 7, 8, and 9. He said, wow, I've got it. This is what I grew up with. This is what I was taught all along. And then all of a sudden he says, yet, whatever gains I have, I regard them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but one that comes through faith in Christ. Here was Paul, this circumcised Jew, Israelite, Benjaminite, Hebrew, Pharisee, blameless law abider. And all of a sudden he says, all this stuff is rubbish. It's garbage. Throw it in a landfill. That's the bottom line. He said, this stuff is just garbage. In fact, it's interesting because if you really want to take it to the full extent of what Paul is saying here, the word that he uses for rubbish in the Greek, it means excrement. So you can fill in the blanks for yourself. But he's saying, this is just garbage. It's rubbish. It means nothing. Because you see, he was playing the game according to the rules that he grew up with. And all of a sudden, he discovers that God is creating a whole new set of rules, a whole new ballgame. It's all different. All different. Because all this stuff that Paul was pursuing, that that his culture and his world said were important and what really helps you get to where you wanted to go and to find this fulfillment and life and all this stuff, he found that it just wasn't working. And it wasn't working because it wasn't working to what God had designed. What God desired and what God designed. Unfortunately, God's in the business of creative repurposing. Because that's what God's been doing for centuries. And he continues to do it today. I mean, look at Jesus. He's walking along and here are these fishermen. Day in and day out. It's not that their lives weren't important. They were. That's a good trade. It's important. But every day it was basically the same thing. You go out, you clean your nets, you fish, you bring your fish in, you clean your nets. Next day you're doing the same thing, day in, day out. And there's nothing wrong with that. It was a good means of livelihood, but that's all their lives were. And then Jesus comes along and he says, guess what? Your lives are going to take on a whole new meaning and a whole new purpose. Just follow me. And they followed him, and their lives were never the same. Creative repurposing, that's what God did in their lives. I think of those 10 lepers that came up to Jesus. They were basically a leper in that time. You were already dead. You just hadn't been buried yet. You were just waiting for this dreaded disease to take its toll on your flesh and your body and everything else until you simply die and were no more. Jesus comes along and he heals them. And one comes back and he just simply says, go. He says, I'm not, you're forgiven. And you have a new life. Go and live that life. And live it well. I don't know what he did, but I'd love to know especially what that 10th leper did for the rest of his life. I can't believe that he didn't do things in his life that were totally different than he ever anticipated or ever expected. Or that woman caught in adultery. Her life was already, her sentence was already given. I mean, she too was also being ready to be disposed of, literally, with her life. They were ready to pile on the stones now. And when that stoning came, it meant death. Until Jesus came along. And her life was on the rubbish pile with Paul there. And he said, he says, I'm not going to condemn you. He said, now just go and sin no more. And I like to think that's exactly what she did. And her life was never the same. That's what God does. That's how God works. And he does it now. He does it today. And he continues to creatively repurpose lives. There's so many things that this world tries to catch our attention with. In this society, in this culture. All these things that it's not that they're not important, they are. But we end up investing all of ourselves into some of the things that we see and think are just going to make us feel fulfilled and whole and full. And yet we continue to feel empty. Until Jesus comes along and touches our hearts and our lives and gives us a whole new purpose and a whole new meaning. Life filled with his love and with his grace. And it's like Paul said later on, going back again to Galatians chapter 2. He simply says, I've been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The old life is gone. The new life has come. And we become a new creation in him. Creative repurposing. That's what God does. And it's because of Christ, and it's because of his sacrifice for us. His love for us. And that's the faith in which we live. That's the faith in which we find wholeness. That's the faith in which we find purpose and direction for our lives. And we feel that hand of God's creative repurposing touching our hearts and our lives and making a difference and a change. And bringing us fullness of life itself. Because Jesus loved us and gave himself for us. And Paul discovered that. Those lives that Jesus touched discovered that.